50 years ago, a new theological graduate school was born, United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. It was created by two distinguished schools, Mission House Seminary and Yankton School of Theology. It was built, however, for the future, to be a dynamic reflection of the United Church of Christ and to forge as a creative force a new understanding of ecumenical theological education in this country. United was built in New Brighton, Minnesota, a suburb, but it had the rural world and the urban world within easy reach. There its ministry would lie.
When Mission House and Yankton moved to the New Brighton campus, it was a whole new cultural setting, a suburban, urban setting. And what were you aware of as the impact of that new setting on the students, the faculty, the whole life of the seminary?
Well, I would say that the urban setting made us intentionally look out to the world, I guess you would call it, both the theological world of the Twin Cities as well as the political and cultural world of the Twin Cities, and made us not quite so insular and parochial as I think we were in our Yankton Mission House context, though even there we were not completely so, because there were ties, particularly worldwide ties with Germany and other parts of the world.
Now we were going to do theological education in an urban center, and no longer in these smaller communities. And of course, that meant we had to come to grips with the major city of St. Paul and the Minneapolis and that area. And so surely we had to know that a new context for our own education was happening. And
a new school was born, the first and only new theological seminary of the United Church of Christ, and one of the first ecumenical seminaries in the United States. It was first to serve the United Church of Christ, the United Methodist, the Presbyterian, and the Episcopal Church. It then extended its reach to the Unitarian Universalists, the Disciples of Christ, the National Baptists, the American Baptists, the Mennonite, the Lutherans, the Roman Catholics, until finally we had students that represented over 20 denominations in the student body. This diversity was not always easy. With this many traditions, we had to grapple with our differences, but at the same time, it was amazingly rewarding. And the whole community, the faculty, the students, the administrators, the board, the friends, the churches, discovered that as they dealt with the diversity of the community, they found paradoxically the common ground in which each was rooted. I've often thought, as a participant in this amazing venture, that surely God was well pleased. What you are about to see are a set of interviews drawn from the school's archives. Some of the interviews, indeed, were only discovered as this project began. They are interviews with people who were here at the laying of the foundation stone. They include as well some figures who fill in those later decades. Not everyone we would like to have on film are here. There simply weren't interviews of them. But we make frequent reference to those persons who were so important to the development of the school. But we have Reuben Hieneman, but not Louis Gunneman. Yet we do talk about Louis Gunneman's role. We have Clyde Steckel, who was dean, but not Tom Campbell. But Campbell's amazing shaping of this school is acknowledged. We have Ben Griffin, who was president, but not Howie Mills, who came before him. But what we do have are a set of representative voices that do speak of where we came from, who we became, and what the mission of this school was all about. It is a fascinating unfolding of people who present us not a linear history of the seminary, but voices about significant moments in the shaping of this school's life.
I think the church helps, or the seminary helps churches deal with difficult times. I also think the church has helped the seminary deal with difficult times. I mean, it just has to be a reciprocal conversation.
If the church wants to have a future, it has to begin at the seminaries and the impact of the seminaries on the life of the church. It seems to me that's where we are today.
I think that paradoxically, one of the areas of hope that I find right now is that so-called mainstream religion is being sidelined, and it's waking up to that fact. What we have so oftentimes looked upon as, quote, the mainline church, the churches that dominate the student body at United Seminary, for example. In terms of numbers, in terms of political power, etc., we have been in a recession for some time. We are losing membership, the major historic denominations, and it's the so-called evangelical, so-called much more conservative groups that are burgeoning in terms of membership and in terms of political influence. Actually, I think that this can be a time of renewal for churches of the former mainstream to realize that it's not life as usual, and it's not life in which we are comfortable with an alliance with the powers of the state and the economy. Because if the message of Christianity, that as we understand it, is going to have relevance, we'll have to see ourselves as an increasing minority. And I think we're going to be forced into a more prophetic kind of position, and one in more creative tension with the powers that be.
Yes, I think the Reform tradition in Protestantism is very much a part of UTS. And that's one of the things that I've come to appreciate about it. So I have my own whole history and tradition, the sacramental tradition of the Roman Catholic Church. But now I also have the Reformed tradition, which says there's nothing that can't be criticized.
Underlying it all was the confirmation that United exists to strengthen the church in all its manifestations. So what can we do? What unique strengths do we have that we can use to make have a meaningful impact on strengthening the church? A church that is struggling.
I think we are going to see the need for a rethinking of the church in terms of what happens out in the churches itself. We have a certain 19th century pietism that still carries over and creates problems for a lot of people, particularly educated people. And clergy have not really been trained to deal with that. Now, it sounds as though they should be, but I find myself still discovering that needs to be worked on, so that the intellectual leadership of the church has to be done in the churches themselves, which is, of course, a basic idea of United Seminary.
In this seminary, it seems to me that people are committed to a kind of religious or theological depth in their lives. So while they're working to learn information, professional skills, they're also trying to develop themselves as decent human beings, grounded in a religious tradition. And we talk about that all the time. So not a day goes by that we don't talk together about the big questions. what it all means, why we're here, why things are the way they are, and sometimes they aren't so good, how they could be better. So I think that constant need to pay attention to questions of religious depth, which is also social depth, makes this a place where we're close to each other in some interesting ways, because when you talk about those depth-filled subjects, you have to tell your own story at the same time. You have to say why you care about those big questions.
The other commitment we embraced was to the ongoing education and support of clergy.
What can the seminary contribute to that world?
Well, I think the seminary has an exciting future, and it's exciting because it does include people who are going to go into the world who will make a difference in a small town, in a suburb, in a city, in the law profession, and in teaching and in social work. They will make a difference. And in the day in which we live, we desperately need the people who will make a difference. That is a difference which will help heal the brokenness that we experience in this society, the divisions of groups over against groups. We need people who will make a difference because they will lead their churches in responding to the issues that rip through and are destructive forces in the life of communities. So what we do and what we will continue to do, and this is why I feel good about our school, is that we will continue to educate people for leadership, a leadership that will indeed help define the way we can move as a church and as a society.
We emerged with a strong bias that a theologically educated laity is essential to a strong congregation and a strong church.
Absolutely.
And we lived in a world where we had a very well-educated clergy, but the fact is that the culture had changed sufficiently that most people sitting in the pews had very little theological education.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe some Sunday school, maybe not.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that it made it so necessary that we engage what was happening in the world. It meant that we couldn't have some kind of a hilltop experience of
Right.
theological education, but we had to come to grips with the death of a president, with the death of Martin Luther King, with the Vietnam War, somehow to grapple theologically and practically how we shall be citizens in this society.
We're about educating persons for leadership, for religious and moral leadership, at a time when the world badly needs creative and dynamic leaders to speak to the religious and moral issues of our time.
Within the strategic plan, we reaffirmed commitment to quality education, commitment to being a progressive school, celebrated our unique position geographically, admired the communitarian feel of United, where all faculty at a single rank receive the same compensation, where the faculty model sharing their lives together and the students enjoy it. And it's implemented through the worship program and through the way in which the curriculum is integrated. So every year I found myself distressed and amazed at what had to be done with incoming students, and astounded at the quality of the students who graduated. I was just blown away by what they could do and who they had become. It was so extraordinary.
One of my convictions about United is that it's very, very grounded in the Christian tradition. But it's also very convinced, we're convinced together, that you can ask as many questions as there are to ask and find adequate responses. Doesn't mean you don't have to work for those adequate responses. and that isn't tough work a lot of the time. But that's one of the things I especially like about United Seminary. We hold very firmly to the Christian tradition. It grounds us. We're centered in it. And we can range pretty far afield then in order to ask all the questions we need to ask. For me, that's a great strength of this place.
We're a global family, and our students and faculty here at United Seminary reflect that global perspective. And our ecumenical focus provides us a healthy tension between diversity and unity that allows us to address in a powerful way the issues that confront our world today.
If a person goes to a seminary in which they do not have this kind of experience, in which you have different kinds of faith stances and diversity, different colors, I think that we would not be thoroughly prepared to meet the challenges that are out there in the world.
New ideas that can come and be discussed. Its openness to all persons of denominational, open, of course, to gays, lesbians, very important in this day and age.
There is much in our culture in terms of unbridled consumerism and so forth, which will do us in as a fragile planet, that must be resisted, and much in the way of unbridled economic greed that must be resisted, and much in the way of racism that must be resisted. We have our agenda cut out for.
I think the most important single thing I would want to say about United is how much I appreciate, from a very personal standpoint, as well as on a public discourse level, the unique and powerful voice that United has. For me, the utter commitment to open intellectual inquiry is the compelling story of United Theological Seminary. People come to be students at United, and they are asked to operate with intellectual rigor. They are asked to master a body of knowledge, but they are not, decidedly not, required to master a body of preconceived beliefs or doctrines. And it is United's commitment to responding to a changing culture, to responding to changing knowledge, and being willing to adapt to change that makes it so vital and so important in our world. Because it's that willingness to address what's changing in our world that keeps our faith relevant and valuable and fresh and vital.
And I remember Louis Gunneman saying once as he was leaving my office, he says, "Molly, as long as we do what we're supposed to be doing, we'll be all right."
I saw that United Seminary was an organizational symbol of the unity which this new United Church of Christ was seeking and developing through its merger. And I thought it had significant symbolic significance to the former evangelical and Reformed church people, as well as the Congregational Church wing that came together. And to me, that it also then was given an ecumenical charter, which was unusual, but also reflective of this new denomination that was formed. That gave it a rather unique role to assume and a trail to pioneer in this new denomination.
My hope for United is that we remain true to our core values and our core commitments. You are a good example of this with your great concern for not only solid theology, but also for social justice commitments that arise out of profound Jewish and Christian tradition and commitments. I would hope we'd continue to do that. We've been a pioneer in that. The second hope I would have is that we would continue to be innovative in terms of how we help people learn about the Christian faith and about leadership and church and society. We've always been kind of on the cutting edge. And I would hope as a new generation of faculty administrators come on board, that will continue to happen. It will not just happen. We'll need to work on that. Thirdly, and finally, in terms of the Minnesota context, we are a unique and distinctive theological voice in the upper Midwest. As you alluded to earlier, with the consortium of Minnesota seminaries, we have a very wonderful and cooperative relationship. But we are, I think our colleagues in other seminaries would say, a truly ecumenical voice. And that's a very important voice. And I would hope we would continue to do that and remind all of us of the whole church and not just a particular part of it. Sure.
They will need to continue to, I think, to hold up these very important values that our strategic planning process articulated and others have articulated. The commitment to progressive education, the commitment to quality education, this ongoing sense of incredible integrity and sharing of lives, I think needs to continue at United. The work in art and religion softens its work in social justice. So you don't get the hard edge you get in some institutions that are committed to social justice.
We have referred to the ecumenical character of the school. Its ecumenicity and its mission as an ecumenical school was laid out most profoundly by Louis Gunneman in a speech in which he said, "The spirit of United is a spirit of being united and uniting." These were words that made up the title of his history of the United Church of Christ. We were united as a school, as a community, united in our faith, but we also were uniting as we sought to address our diversity, our differences, in our search for common ground.
Oh, I was going to interject. Louis Gunneman, of course, had a role in that as well.
Well, he was crucial.
He was crucial.
He was the initiating, the beginning dean. In many ways, he was the intellectual force behind the whole venture.
That's the way I would see it.
And it was Louis, in many ways, who made it ecumenical. Reuben created it to be ecumenical. And the two of them were an amazing team.
And then another thing that certainly had a big impact in the 80s was the ecumenical movement.
Right.
And the seminary had been founded as an ecumenical seminary under the auspices of the United Church of Christ. But because we were a new kind of creature in the area, I think we were sought out. I remember being welcomed by on the campus of the Baptist Seminary. They had a reception for us. And then the Luther faculty, seminary faculty also. But the thing that was particularly welcoming and interesting was that the overtures from St. John's University.
Right.
The second issue was to try to be more intentional in serving our historic constituencies. You mentioned earlier that we're an ecumenical seminary, and there are well over 20 different denominations who send us students. But primarily and historically, as you know, the United Church of Christ, the United Methodist Church, the Episcopal Church, and the Presbyterian Church, and in recent years, the Unitarian Universalist Association. So one of my tasks was to try to continue and to deepen those relationships so we could be more responsive to the needs of those particular traditions.
I think one of the important things there in that period was the way in which we worked together with other seminaries.
I think the ecumenical approach to our courses make them very vital, make them accessible to lots of different people. And one of the things we say that you may have heard already is that we emphasize process as well as content. So we tend to, in this course that I talked about, the introductory course, what we try to do is ask questions rather than give answers. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have any responses, we don't think there are any answers, but we're more likely to say, when we give a lecture, which I give tomorrow night, we're more likely to say, what is theology? What is religion? Rather than, this is what theology is, get down these 10 points, or this is what religion is. We try to open things up rather than just close them down.
We invite persons from different faith traditions and enable them to explore the richness of those traditions while at the same time seeking their common roots in the Christian faith.
Well, we do say about ourselves that we are an ecumenical seminary. By that we mean we serve many denominations in our student body. We have students from 21, 2 or 3 groups. I'm not sure the exact number any one year. We have faculty from several major denominational backgrounds. And we try to teach, I think, around the core convictions that comprise the unity of the Christian movement and of religious life. We also try to provide the specific studies each student needs for her or his church tradition, where they're going to be serving or where they now are serving. But we do stress, I think, what we can learn from one another. And I've heard many students say that when they're here as a student, they get a sense of the diversity and richness of the wider church that helps them to be stronger in their own faith, in their own tradition.
United Seminary was born with a dual focus. The first was to respond to a world that suffers and to help celebrate with the world signs of hope and humanity. Jim Nelson, who was professor of Christian ethics, once said, "We are called by God to make the world a more humane place, to make the world a place where the humanity that God envisions for us will be realized." The second focus was not outward, but inward. The faculty sought to engage the students in their own spiritual development, in their theological inquiry, in understanding their own emotional selves, to the end that their ministry, whether lay or ordained ministry, might be a ministry which they would wear as a mantle that had true substance and meaning.
There are many ways of characterizing this, but it had to have a foundation of mutual respect, of openness to intellectual inquiry, and a strong sense of community. If indeed we were to achieve the type of collegiality so crucial to this institution's life.
And with this inner journey, there had to be an awareness that we were creatures of finitude and creatures of human possibility, that we were people who had sinful propensity and people who were capable of doing the good. These realities had to be integrated into the person's life so that they had not only a general but a real existential understanding of Michael's words, to do justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God.
If we were called by God to minister to the society, then we needed to understand it. We needed to respond to it. We needed to provide it leadership. And if the words of Micah said something of what that was about, then the building itself and its architecture said it visually. When you went into the building, you were suddenly surrounded by massive pieces of glass, windows. And when you worked in the building, the light flowed in to allow you to do the work, but the eye was always aware of the world outside, so that the building itself suggested visually that we were focused on the outside, on the world, not simply our inner life as a community. The seminary building was not a fortress designed to ward off the weapons of secularity. It was a strong building that was open, and it invited people to see the fact that they lived as individuals in a world of community.
The architecture of the classroom building was drawn in such a way that there were the large windows
right
along the corridor, which was designed somewhat like a monk's walk.
Mm-hmm.
But the corridor and the classrooms were built in such a way they would be open to the windows.
Right.
Symbolize the openness of the seminary to the world.
There was the need, which is again not unique to United Seminary, to attend to deferred maintenance on our buildings and to address the fact that we needed additional space, particularly for faculty offices and for the library.
There were two things. One, the building should express openness, a dialogical relationship to the world. And the other, stability.
Well, I think it's openness to new ideas. I love its design with its large windows. It's not enclosed.
And that was a very important part for me. I've always loved books and wanted the seminary to have the best of books. And I think my proudest moment was when I was able to get the library remodeled into its two levels rather than just one level as it had been.
Yes, a real library, exactly.
In 2004, with the support of Mary Bigelow Macmillan and donors who contributed to a campaign, we built a new chapel, the Bigelow Chapel. It was a work of art. The architecture, designed by Joan Serrano and John Cook, was a work of artistic grace that invited the grace of God to be amongst us. Playing on light, earth-formed materials, and strong lines that pointed to the heavens and nurturing lines that spoke of the presence of God, it became a central place of meeting, a central place of centering our religious life. It became that place where our walk together was a dialogue.
I've always had a real passion for world religions and the study of religion, and I would have to say the ecumenical nature of the space really attracted me. Yes. So that it wasn't one particular set of rituals, set of beliefs. And so really what you're dealing with is you kind of have to peel away the rituals and the beliefs and try to understand what is universal about spirituality. And that to me was the most compelling force that drove this design. Initially the design was the dynamic or the juxtaposition of the very simple straight lines of the exterior, the planar geometry, juxtaposed with this very sinuous curve, this wood curve. One without the other, they're supposed to talk and work together as kind of forming the language of this chapel. So I would say this is really not complete until that curve goes in. And initially you might ask, well, why would you want light to come through wood? And the idea is that when you look at light coming through wood, it casts a very warm glow. And the initial idea from the interior of the chapel perspective was that it almost feels like a cocoon, like their arms are embracing you as you pray or meditate or worship.
The inner life of the school was characterized by a sense of collegiality. Indeed, it became integral to the very way of being as a community. One person was a president, one person was a faculty member, one a student, one a staff member, one a board member. They all played different roles, they all had different authority. And yet, when they worked together, there was a spirit of collegiality. This was important, for it meant that there was a type of mutual respect, a type of equity of appreciation that was always there in the interaction.
Perhaps Gene Jayberg, who was professor of communication and taught preaching, said best what the essence of this collegiality was when he said, in referring to our work with social justice issues, that our walk together can be our dialogue.
I think one of the things that I want to emphasize so strongly was the wonderful sense of collegiality that we had there in those years under Dean Gunneman and so on. He was such a master in welding us together as a faculty and all. And I still, that's the finest experience of collegiality were in those years at Mission House and United. I'm deeply grateful for those two.
That collegiality has persisted. It's in our DNA or our culture in some way.
Yeah.
And when Mary McNamara came a couple of years ago to be our new president, that was one of the first things she noticed and remarked about. She had never been at a school before where there was that much collegiality among the faculty, and it was just an amazing experience for her to see.
We have, or we tried, and I don't know if we always succeeded, but we tried to at least act collegial if we were not collegial.
Right. At least.
And it's not to say we always liked each other all that much, but we at least tried not to undercut each other, I think.
Right. Respect, mutual respect and support, right.
Yes, yes. And that was done in a variety of ways. The sabbatical program, I think, contributed to that. That we were all, in that sense, equals. And even though we had different ranks, rank did not count for a major factor in any discussion or action.
Part of the strength of this faculty that has been noted by accrediting groups that have come from our accrediting associations is that we do have, I think, an extraordinary degree of faculty collegiality and mutual affection, which is unusual in higher education, where often faculties are composed of people who are themselves prima donnas in their approach to their fields, who are highly politicized and are trying to figure out who's on my side, who's on the other side. Politicized in the sense of forming little factions among students and faculty. We have just had very, very little of that here, ever. And that's partly because of who we are and partly because of how we've worked at that. We've really committed ourselves to maintaining that kind of mutual respect and affection on the faculty, to keep that body, that faculty body, strong and healthy. That has been a wonderful gift to me through the years.
The heart of a theological school is its curriculum. A curriculum can become rigid, labored by too many rules and requirements, or it can become unfocused, labored by too few rules and too few requirements. The school long committed to a dialectical way of perceiving reality, could well claim that it has been most creative when its curriculum reflected a dynamic tension between these two poles. We have structure and expectations woven through the curriculum, but we invite new ways of thinking and innovation. We provide order and freedom for intellectual and spiritual growth. When the school was formed, neo-orthodoxy was the dominant theological model in theological education, and the pedagogical and curricular approach was to teach doctrine with the add-on of a few practical courses. United had a dalliance with this model for a brief period, but then the faculty decided to turn that model upside down.
The turning away from the old model to the creation of a new model was greatly informed by three major theologians: Paul Tillich and his thought with regard to the theology of culture, Reinhold Niebuhr and his Christian realism, and H. Richard Niebuhr and his focus on contextual theology and ethics. These figures' thought permeated the curriculum itself, but the curriculum's upside-downness was not simply dependent on the ideas of a few theologians. Rather, that changing from the old to the new model involved the faculty rethinking what is theology, and how do you teach theology, and how do you make theology relevant to where people live. And therein lay a redesign of courses. They became all-day courses rather than Monday, Wednesday, and Friday one-hour courses. And there was interaction in small groups as well as lectures, the use of many field settings and field study tours. The curriculum really took a new shape that was innovative and new and became a model for other theological schools that were going through curriculum revision.
At the time, the mid-1960s, the new curriculum was developed under the leadership of Louis Gunneman, the dean, and Tom Campbell, a young faculty member who would in later years serve as the dean of the seminary. They and the president and faculty shaped this new curriculum, but Tom Campbell was particularly innovative in his articulation of Paul Tillich's approach to theology and culture, and in guiding the conversation that needed to take place regarding how the Christian faith should relate to culture and how the preparation of people for ministry should be an integration of theory and practice in all of the courses taught. An understanding of integration, context, and Christ transforming culture. These ideas ran deeply through the current of the curriculum, and they are still deep running in the curriculum of our current time.
In the development of the curriculum, this is not widely known, and I maybe not important, but I remember the faculty struggling with how do we do theological work in our day, and we met many times, and there were certain learnings that had already occurred. I remember Paul Hammer, who was chairing a committee on curriculum at that time, came to me and said, this is somehow isn't gelling. And I said, the problem is that we're starting at the wrong end. And we ought to begin where the people are and where the students are, and then move to the more sophisticated conceptions that would come later. So we shouldn't start with abstract theology. Let's do it the other way. And I think that was kind of a turning point. And I remember Paul asked me to write a little paragraph, so I wrote a few pages on that. And I really think that was perhaps my most important contribution.
I think that that's a very crucial thing too in terms of the setting.
Yeah, I think so, and I think there was a very sincere, conscientious effort to contextualize the curriculum.
Yes.
In relation to the urban setting.
Yes.
The new curriculum also required a major attention to contextual education, which years ago would have been called field education, but the assisting students to reflect deeply on what they were learning as they worked in local congregations or in other settings of ministry.
You see, my own understanding of Scripture is that Scripture doesn't begin with Scripture. The biblical writers begin where people are.
Right.
When Paul writes his letters, he doesn't say, well, let's do exegesis first.
That's correct.
He said he deals with the congregation, and then he taps into the theological and scriptural stuff. So I think that process that went on then in revising was, I was very, very enthusiastic about that.
So we conceived the Academy for Vital Christianity and were very fortuitously approached by both the United Methodist Church and the UCC, who wanted to do more lay education. And so we were able to collaborate with the two denominations, which was extremely helpful. And out of that was born what we have today as the Academy. I continue to believe that is a great resource. Our faculty is second to none in their ability to teach and bring alive what the Christian tradition, the richness and potential of the Christian tradition.
There was always that concern that we would be engaged with the world.
Yes, right, exactly. And with the new curriculum, you'll remember that we had the field trips associated with some of those core courses. And
right.
People going out.
Particularly the urbanization.
Right.
We took students both into Minneapolis and, if I remember right, even to Chicago.
That's right. And certainly to the state capitol in St. Paul. And
right.
A lot of activities of that kind.
But was happy to be part of the early process of giving shape to a new curriculum which was instituted several years after the seminary started, which was built on a model of attempting to correlate the Christian gospel or the theological insights of a faith community with the kinds of questions that culture was asking, the kinds of issues that culture was bringing up. This kind of dialogical sort of pattern, and that informed the shaping of so many of our courses as well as the curriculum as a whole. In the field of ethics, for example, we as part of the curriculum, early we devised some introductory courses required of all entering Master of Divinity students. And we called those Christian Faith and the Social Order, Christian Faith and Economics and Politics, Christian Faith and the Human Personality. Those took place right at the beginning of the students' theological pilgrimage. And that was kind of a flip-flop on what traditional theological curricula had done, as you so well know, which had waited until the end to apply
more theory to application.
Right. That's right. And so our attempt was to initiate the dialogue right away. And
the curriculum has at its core a principle, a philosophical principle that we call reflective engagement. We believe that everyone who studies here, who takes a program here, should be able to become reflective about the world in which they live, their experience of that world, the religious institutions, the culture, the society. And we believe that everyone should be engaged in that world for the sake of transformation toward greater human justice, toward greater peace among all people, greater unity of all people.
Let's remember Bob's contribution, your husband's.
Yes.
He was professor of education.
Yes.
Christian education.
Yes.
And he also did work with the students.
Yes, in their field studies.
The school, over time, went through great changes, and these changes were marked foremost by growth. It started out with a small faculty, a small student body, and practically no support staff. It was not easy, and we were faced from the very beginning with the question of how we would fund the needs of the seminary. Initially, the seminary had no endowment and was dependent on the denomination. The denominational funding, however, was phased out. We created a regional funding institution called CUE, Chicago, United, Eden, the three regional seminaries, and that was a very important source of income for the schools, and it still is. But still, the funding was inadequate. We developed a program, however, a development program, in which we created an alumni giving program. We created donor initiatives. We created campaigns. We created foundation and grant programs, all of which began to become sustaining sources of funding. The endowment, however, even by the mid-1990s, was still only at $5 million. And so there needed to be an endowment campaign. We held it, and it was successful, and the endowment, through its own growth and through the money we got, reached $16 million. The problem was in the financial health of the society. In 2008, the downturn occurred. This hurt the endowment, and while we have recovered from that, we nevertheless are seeking funding to grow and develop our own position of stability and monies to develop new programs. And so the task is an ongoing one. From the very beginning of the school, therefore, to the present time, financial support remains a continuing issue. In these interviews that you're going to see, you will hear from the people who have lived with this issue, and you will see what they did that worked and what they did that failed, but nevertheless, what they did that made the difference, that gave us financial viability.
For one thing, the support system for both of the merging schools was fairly solid, but hardly adequate to developing a larger program. The uncertainties came in large part out of, because of the close relationship to the United Church of Christ, to the fact that the United Church of Christ still was in a very formative period. And our relationship as an institution of higher education was through the Board for Homeland Ministries and its Department of Higher Education. Well, that department didn't really know what it wanted to do, to be quite honest, because there were those who felt that there should be no more seminaries, particularly seminaries that were not strictly related to universities. That had to be dealt with. The financial situation had to be dealt with. The fact that there were other colleges that were, there had been a support program, CHEF I think it was called, to raise money for the congregational schools, but that had been preempted by the colleges that were related to the church, and so of course there was very little money that could be secured from that program. Meanwhile, the Evangelical and Reformed part of the United Church had just engaged and was engaged in a financial program to support seminaries, which was called Seminary Support Program. Dr. Louis Goebel, who was the president of the church, headed that effort. And over a period of 3 years, the seminary finally got $500,000 out of that effort. And in a sense it was successful, but it also had the advantage of bringing the need of the seminaries to the attention of the churches, on which then could be built what is what's called the Seminary Regional Support Plan, which is now CUE, the program for support for Chicago, Eden, and United Seminary, all three related seminaries to the United Church in the Midwest. And but none of that was in place at that time. That had to be developed.
We developed a whole range of individual donor who had an interest in this kind of an institution. We took our case with the help of some key community leaders to several corporations who, after initial shyness about religious institutions for religious purposes, discovered they needed to support this kind of a religious institution for the sake of the quality of life of the whole community. And also then took our case to key foundations and were able to garner ongoing support from foundations, corporations, and a growing number of individuals to help balance and round out the support that was somewhat shrinking and vanishing from denominational budgets and local church budgets. It became clear to me, and several helped point out the fact that the seminary needed to address its financial situation as a very young, promising school. And so that became a major concern and the focus of most of my work over the 11 years while I was there.
The most important problem with seminaries is money.
Yes.
Very few foundations will give money to religious organizations, and so they're dependent on churches and on individuals. And so that was our first issue. And the second issue was that the seminary had 10 or 12 faculty houses, and the faculty were beginning to want to go and move to where they wanted to move to and build their own home equity. So consequently, we had a great deal of land, and we had and we had houses that I was able to hand over the seminary to Howard Mills from the United Church of Canada without that kind of dangling impediment, you might say.
Yes.
And
yes.
And with the land situation in a better situation, so that people in the business community would be willing to give to us, knowing that we had done our best to raise as much money as we could for ourselves.
And I need to say, Bob, that these issues are not unique to United Seminary. They're very similar issues that still confront both Roman Catholic and Protestant and Anglican seminaries in the United States and Canada. One is the need for adequate financial support. And depending upon the denomination, the degree and the level of that support has continued to decrease. In the United Church of Christ, it seemed to decrease first and fastest. And so one issue was how to, with the support of our wonderful friends in the Twin Cities and throughout Minnesota, how to increase the financial support so that we could carry out the great mission that the faculty has done, as you know, in all of our years. That was one issue.
We had to look at things like what role could this seminary play as its natural constituency. The United Church of Christ and the mainline denominations were in decline, as there was increasing competition from other seminaries. As more and more people, especially young adults, were considering themselves to be religious, or spiritual but not religious. And as the donor base for United, the historic donor base was aging itself. And so there were many strategic issues. And then one of the things that had made this very capable Board of Trustees uneasy was that they couldn't really get a handle on the finances of the seminary. So I brought a tool from Union to United in which we could create 10-year projections and modify them easily. And by the time I had left, we had created 30 different scenarios for the future of the school using those projections. In a related kind of step, United had been managed for several years focusing on the operating budget but deferring maintenance.
Yes.
And the seminary realized that because the roofs were leaking, we couldn't do that anymore. And so we went ahead and made the capital repairs that were needed, which made our finances look worse, but in fact, where it had to be done.
The seminary has achieved a level of stability and financially, And I think that's enabled the seminary to be a place where people can devote themselves passionately to teaching and learning and being present in the community as ministers and chaplains and all of the wonderful ways in which graduates of the seminary serve.
One of the first things I learned when I came in 1967 was that we were lean and mean. Well, I certainly knew that we were lean. I don't know how mean we were, except we were mean in terms of how we used our resources very carefully. And we began to develop an endowment which gave us some flexibility, and the institution grew both in terms of the size of the student body and in terms of faculty and in terms of professional staff and supportive staff. And so the institution began to take a fuller place as a theological school, and we were the ecumenical voice in this part of the country. And so it was a marvelous experience, but always we had to deal with the question of resources. But slowly, we built the endowment. The endowment literally from nothing to roughly $16, $17 million. And then we had downturns in the economy, and they hurt. But nevertheless, we built them up. And so we kept having campaigns, and our people responded, and we will continue to do that. But the fact that this institution was begun with limited resources, but we did so much with those resources to create what we now have, I think is a remarkable accolade to the school itself. And in many ways, the gem of that perhaps is the Bigelow Chapel, which combines our artistic interests, but it also combines the will of a people to create something that will make a difference.
We also, Gene, had and continue to have a wonderful group of friends out in the community who believed in the seminary from the beginning and stayed with the seminary in their commitment and their support.
Right.
And so that I think we were able to shift, if you will, from a vision of scarcity, that it's a struggle, to a vision of abundance.
In the history of the school, the focus on social justice issues was there from the beginning. We worked in our curriculum and in our field settings with the inner city, with issues of poverty, family breakdown, community disorder. We worked with the Native American community in a special partnership to meet the needs of Indian churches, both in the city and on the reservation. And we developed programs with the University of Minnesota, and particularly the program in human sexuality. United joined with the National Office of the Evangelical Lutheran Church and their partner, the University of Minnesota Medical School and its program in human sexuality, to create a program, an intense program, for seminary students and for medical students that would engage them in looking at sexuality societally, in groups, and in themselves, at the emotional level, the biological level, and the spiritual level. It was a controversial program, but a very successful one. Jim Nelson was its architect, and his own work in the program and his many writings give testimony to what was accomplished. In that sexuality program, we also dealt with other major social issues: the question of abortion, the question of homosexuality, homophobia, and sexual orientation. We dealt with ethics and sexuality in people's lives, and in that whole process, we tended to the question of social justice. Environmental issues were dealt with, and the women's revolution and the issues that revolution posed were treated. But of all of these issues, the issue of civil rights and racial justice was a continuing matter dealt with from the beginning of the seminary's life. We had members of the faculty who went on the Freedom Rides. We had students who protested against racial segregation. We developed a white racism workshop that was used not only by our students, but by students in other seminaries, by churches, and by community organizations. We developed a church and race program. And the treatment of that issue is still ongoing, or it is still ongoing in the society where we live. Our treatment of war, which occurred around the Vietnam War and reappeared in the wars regarding Iraq and Afghanistan, became another matter to be treated under the large rubric in the midst of our work with racial justice.
Yes, in the 50s and through the 60s, Protestant denominations worked together in the West Side Christian Parish in Chicago, the Denver Inner City Parish, the Cleveland Inner City Parish, the Blue Hill Parish near Boston, as well as East Harlem. And there were, even in Atlanta and some southern cities, again, a united Protestant witness.
I think early on in my time at United, my major interests were in the economic and the political parts of life, and I spent quite a bit of time on issues of politics, church and state, and so forth. And then gradually my issues began to shift, and what began to engage me was biomedical issues. In the late 60s, we branched out and developed relations with the medical school and with Hennepin County Medical Center for joint teaching.
Actually, Ellen McAllister started this with the yearly trips to Palestine, Israel. With
Israel, that's right, yes.
But I began to introduce, during the winter term of each year, a procedure of taking students and sometimes members of the community too to various countries in Latin and Central America.
I can intellectually understand white racism and prejudice against black people. But emotionally, I cannot understand it because I've never experienced it. And so early on, and my parents were this way all their lives, even though they grew up in the South, is a very strong commitment to treat all people equally. And that came out of my family, but also out of my early African experience.
How would I want to be remembered?
Good question.
I would say it would be for my passion for social justice.
I personally am much more comfortable with that approach to men's work that believes that our concerns are not only for personal transformation, for a more enriching and satisfying and relationally enriched life as men, but also for social transformation, because some of the deepest problems, I'm convinced, of our world, from social violence to white racism to environmental abuse, are deeply intertwined with the massive distortions of masculinity models. And I think that can be demonstrated. So it's that combination of personal and social transformation that I believe the churches ought to be concerned about for men.
We still at United, we're very much aware of the whole racial dimensions of those issues that were happening, and so it was a time that demanded how shall we engage the world from our own particular theological perspective.
Right. We did some demonstrations in cooperation with Luther.
I am terribly concerned not only about the gulf and the suffering that is causing between rich and poor, but also what this is saying about the moral fabric of our society, whether or not we are losing a sense of community, that we are all in this together as a society.
We concluded that we should put more of a focus on peace and justice, and developed a concentration in peace and justice for really any degree-seeking student could adopt that concentration and have a degree that enabled the person to move into any number of spheres of work, from the church to nonprofits to for-profits, for that matter, NGOs and the like.
Well, you were suggesting, Bob, the increasing gulf between rich and poor, and I think that is a concern of major proportion. And one of the things that I, among many others, you I'm sure, have been very concerned about our current Congress is that the leadership and the weight in this particular Congress seems to be successful in believing and convincing others that the greedy are the needy and the needy are the greedy.
We developed a white racism workshop.
Yeah.
Well,
right.
That was a workshop that was used not only by us but by other schools to really confront what it means to be white in this society. Exactly. See, everybody was used to raising the question, what does it mean to be black? Or what does it mean to be Hispanic? Or what does it be Asian American? Indeed. We tried to turn the table and say, what does it mean to be white? And if you don't come to terms with your whiteness, you're going to have problems coming to terms with a world where we are of all races and all colors, and we work together.
Interestingly, Buber once said, we can simply walk together, and that can be a dialogue.
United began with an all-male cast, both in the student body and in the faculty. But by the late 1960s, we had women students and we had women faculty. We went much further, however, than simply developing an open community in the degree programs, in the faculty, within the student body, because we sought to integrate into our theology a feminist perspective, into our pedagogy a feminist perspective, and into our way of relating to each other a feminist perspective. It's hard to overestimate how important this was to the life of the school. It represented a sea change that is with us now and has made us a much healthier institution.
You could say that I was among the first to think about courses in women's studies and to think we really should have a program. We should call this something, because we have a long history of commitment to women's issues. And as more and more women faculty were coming, and we all taught in different areas, it began to seem to me that we could have a women's studies program.
We began to have women students, and we had to re-educate the faculty. and the women helped re-educate the faculty, but we had these sharp women students who in some denominations couldn't yet be ordained, but we were still preparing them for ordination. And this faculty became a major faculty in theological education in writing about feminist issues, in writing about how we can begin to understand God, we can begin to understand the faith in light of concerns that are raised out of women's experience as well as men's experience.
I became aware of my need as a man in our society to really be part of a movement that was carefully and thoughtfully re-examining our inherited masculinities, because those masculinities, the cultural constructions of our gender meanings, have become, for so many of us, not very fulfilling, and oftentimes on a large scale, masculinity had become violent and destructive in our society. The men's movement began really as an offshoot of the second great wave of feminism in our society.
I did offer, I believe for the first time this was added to the curriculum, but a course that dealt with some of the research on how women think and what might be educational strategies that would be more suitable to women. For an idea, for instance, that wasn't even explored when I was studying, an increased emphasis on feminist studies in theology.
Women have been historically, systematically excluded from public participation in their various religious traditions. So women for many, many years weren't allowed to preach, or they could only preach under certain special circumstances. They didn't teach in theological seminaries, they didn't get theological degrees. Women were very active in the churches and often held their churches together, but they didn't lead publicly. They weren't on church councils, and that's changing.
Religion and the arts has been a major area of work in the life of this institution, again, from its very beginning down through the present. Gene J. Burke, in the very early years, developed one of the leading religious drama programs in theological education. This is a program where plays reviewed by the city newspapers had productions of Tennessee Williams and T.S. Eliot, Lillian Hellman, and Arthur Miller. It was a theater production that had the first integrated cast in the Twin Cities. It was a program that continued in different ways as we had interns at the Guthrie Theater, and then continued through student productions that occurred throughout the years. This was really the introduction of the seminary to the area of religion and the arts. But in the midst of that, we had music. Philip Brunel taught hymnody. We had liturgical dance.
There were two events in the life of the Religion and Arts program, however, that had very special significance. One was the development of the Masters of Arts in Theology and the Arts, and concentrations that existed in the Doctor of Ministry program and in the MDiv program. In effect, the treatment of religion and the arts were integrated into the degree programs themselves. And the second event was the hiring of a director of the Religion and Arts program, Cindy Beth Johnson, who gave it a direction, a focus, gave it the creative swath that it needed to cover the areas that we wanted to treat. And so the Religion and Arts program became a significant part of the life of this school and its curriculum.
In talking about this work with the arts, I think it's very important that we remember the extraordinary work you did with video and film in terms of actual productions.
We did do a kind of summer theater program, and my insistence, it happened in the mid to late 60s, into the 70s perhaps, but my insistence was that we both deal with the justice issue in the plays we selected to do, and also have an interracial cast. And as I think about it, well, it was not only important to me, but a lot of people to do that.
Well, I think you should mention the fact that it was one of the first interracial experiences in theater in these cities.
I think it may have.
Very important was the question of race and white racism, the issue of family and marriage and what was happening. And then the extraordinary work that was done by Jim Nelson and others with the medical school in human sexuality. And then we dealt with issues of feminism
and and issues of gender, and we've dealt with homosexuality and heterosexuality and what a new vision should be in that arena and of living together. And we always were honed to deal with the world where it was. Now, in that process, the question was raised, not first by me, but by you. And that is, what do the arts tell us about the world we live in? Whether it was literally the neighborhood, or whether it literally was the human soul. And you began that exploration with your marvelous religious drama program. And we'll come back to that.
Yeah.
But that was from the very beginning of the school.
Well, it was, Wilson. I would have to say that the world of the arts was important to me always. But to introduce it into the theological curriculum, I was taking a gamble, because I had not had the time or the energy or the inclination to pursue it at the proper level, which you did. But I knew it had to be in the curriculum.
We also celebrated the arts and religion. I knew immediately from talking with Wilson Yates and Cindy Beth Johnson that we were enjoying at United a quality of leadership in the arts that matched or exceeded what we had in New York. And that could not be lost. And so we created more programs, much to their exhaustion probably. Because when you celebrate something, you don't make it smaller, you make it larger. And then added the panels at the Guthrie. And that was great fun. We shared those with the other seminaries and just had a wonderful time working with Sheila Livingston there and with all the folks at the Guthrie and having our seminary presidents on stage and other leaders. So that was great fun. And people are still enjoying that. We're planning that as part of our best practices presentation for all seminaries across the country, which will happen in June.
We embraced our strength in religion and arts, but said, so how do we use that to strengthen the church? And we went and we applied for a grant from the Calvin Institute and received it. And with that grant, we were able to fund a year-long effort with 5 Twin Cities congregations. And the idea was that instead of having a workshop here or a workshop there, we could work with a congregation over an extended period of time to bring elements of the arts into worship and to enrich worship in ways that perhaps would be impossible to do if one person from a congregation went to a workshop one day. And so that, again, was a very pivotal time for us, because it enabled us to move from the ivory tower, so to speak, of religion and arts to doing hands-on work in bringing the arts into worship in a meaningful way.
Really, in the latter major art forms that we dealt with the visual arts, painting and sculpture and architecture. And we did these not as if this were a school where you dealt with religion and arts, but rather we did this in a way of integrating the arts into our courses, to realize that the arts touch our life in a spiritual way. They give us insight into the historical faith and what the spirituality of those people was like. They raise religious questions. Paul Tillich loved to talk about how the religious questions of meaning and purpose in life, of God, of Christ, of the Trinity, of issues of being and non-being and love and justice and evil and good in the world were raised by the arts, and that the arts could be prophetic against injustices in the world and It could be a source that was sacramental in character, a means of grace, a way in which we encountered the holy, whether that was in a hymn on Sunday morning, or whether that was in a play at the Guthrie or in your religious drama program, or whether that was in a painting. It is where we could encounter our own spiritual depths.
For 50 years, United Theological Seminary has been an inclusive presence in the life of the church and the world. It has made culture the context for talking about God and humanity. And it is sought to help the world realize the humanity that God envisions us all to have. May United Seminary, in the next 50 years, continue to respond to the world's ills and to celebrate its wonder.
A few years back, I discovered these 5 Greek words in the New Testament that all have the same root.
Same root, that's right.
And all of those charis, eucharistia, charismata, character, and chara, that those all then translated of grace and gratitude and gifts and character and joy.
Yes.
I just think it's amazing that those, for me, hang together.
They do.
With the quality of United.
Right.
We were a school of grace and gratitude and gifts. And the word character, it's a rare word in the New Testament.
Yes.
But it means to bear the imprint of God.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And all you tie all those things together, and you're going to have a community of joy.
United has never been afraid of speaking the truth to power.
Mm-hmm.
And it also has never been afraid of creating beauty. And when you bring those together with a strong sense of spirituality, you have a jewel of an institution that should not be lost, but should be burnished.